Hello and welcome to today's webinar. This is a webinar, an update from Washington on public policy and on COVID-19. It's presented by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. This is the 23rd webinar in our series about COVID-19, and as you can see from today's title, we are talking COVID, of course, and government response, but we're also going to talk about some other topics, other public policy issues of significance. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Today's webinar, like all of the previous, are presented by the Franklin Partnership, which is the on-the-ground DC lobbying team for NTMA and PMA, and by the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. And we are the folks who also work in DC, working with the Franklin Partnership to put out messages for NTMA and PMA in communication, whether it's print, digital, or other media, and advance the narrative in those different platforms. So joining everybody to give the presentations, I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. On today with me from Bracewell is Paul Nathanson. And then we also have the guys from the Franklin Partnership, of course, Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. And I will turn it over to them very shortly, but before we do that, there's a couple of quick things to cover. First, you can find a recording of today's podcast and download the slides on our website at onevoiceinfo.org. There's lots of information there. Much of the content that will be covered today, you can find it there. And also you can find, of course, this webinar and the previous 22 other webinars if you want to go back and listen to previous webinars. You can also find our podcast on the website and anywhere else that you get podcasts. It's called Talking with One Voice, and we record the podcast every other week. So the weeks that we don't do the webinars, we record the podcast. So check it out. Find us and subscribe on any podcast platform. What we typically talk about are issues that impact the manufacturing industry. We talk a little bit of policy, a little bit of politics. So lots of good content there. Do check it out. The other thing I want to bring to your attention is we've got a new video series called 2 Minutes with One Voice. It's coming out weekly. It's a 2-minute video featuring one of the folks on today's webinar giving an update. Those videos are distributed by each association, by NTMA and PMA. So check with your association to see the best platform to get them. So with that housekeeping done, you can see the agenda for today, lots of content to cover. So we will jump right in. I'm going to talk briefly about new information out from CDC, and then I'll turn it over to John to kick us off with President Biden's first 100 days. So quickly first out from CDC. This is new guidance which identifies categories for essential workers when it comes to vaccine distribution. So this guidance includes, as you can see on the screen, a number of different categories of manufacturing workers and categorizes those folks as part of phase 1B. Now, phase 1B, for most people who have been following this, you'll know that follows the so-called jumpstart phase, which was really just healthcare workers and residents in long-term care facilities. So this puts manufacturing workers pretty quickly up in line. Many states are actually already to 1B. These categories come from ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. That's a group of medical and public health experts. But here's what you really need to know. This is guidance from CDC. So some states are going to follow this and have manufacturers right up there in 1B. Other states may be weighing other factors. So it's not necessarily going to be this way in your state. As you've seen all across the board since we started covering COVID nearly a year ago, the decisions are being made at the state and local level. This is important guidance because it's used by state and local decision makers to make decisions about vaccine implementation. But of course, things do vary from state to state. We are happy to work with you to advocate and provide more information about manufacturers as essential workers, just as we did at the start of the pandemic. So what else did CDC put out? Put out a communication toolkit. So this is interesting. CDC's been putting out communication toolkits since the start of the pandemic. This latest edition is on vaccines, why to get them, how to get them. There's a lot in the toolkit. So I think on the next slide, you can really see it breaks down what you have. You have an introductory letter, of course, but you've got key messages, there's a slide presentations, there's a different fact sheets about the vaccine, which come in a variety of different languages, newsletter content, letters to your employees, and social media content as well. So for people who may be looking to communicate with their employees about the vaccine, provide information about it and about distribution plans, there's a lot in this that may be useful to you there, and all the links are available here on this slide, so you can easily click through and find information if you're looking to share that with your workforce. And here's just more on all the social media stuff. And what we'll be doing with this on the social media is we will be sharing this content on the One Voice accounts. And so you can also grab it from us. And if you would rather repurpose it that way, or if that's easier for you, you can find it there as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to John. I know you guys have lots to cover on the policy side, so let me turn it over to you to kick it off with what we've seen so far in Biden's first 100 days, which not very many have passed, but still a lot of action to cover. John, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hey, this has been a crazy first couple of weeks of the Biden administration, a whirlwind of activity. I think we're up to 28 executive orders, since January 20th when the president took over. And so it's clearly been a very busy time. As this next slide, there's been a lot of discussion about is the president taking advantage of the executive order provisions. Well, as you can see, many presidents have done executive orders. He's clearly, if you extrapolate out the 28 that he's done already in the first 11 days or so, it would work out to over 12-month period 576. I doubt most presidents do a lot of their executive orders at the beginning of their administration. It is not law. It is just it is rules for the term of that current president. So clearly, even if he did 576, it would be more than President Trump, more than President Obama, but far less than what Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR did moving forward. So what are some of these executive orders? Some of them do impact us. What the president has done, clearly, he's elevated climate change as not just a foreign policy, but a national security issue. So we're going to be looking at every federal agency who puts out a rule or regulation, that they're going to look at the impact that regulation is going to have on climate change. And it also will kick off an emissions target to increase emissions targets by April of 2022. We've already seen, and there's much discussion about the Buy American provisions. The president came out with an executive order enhancing Buy American provisions, but these are just for federal purchases. He closes the loopholes. He makes it difficult to get a waiver from Buy American provisions. We've also seen him reverse some of the executive orders put forth by the Trump administration. One, Trump said federal employees could not engage in collective bargaining. President Biden's new executive order allows federal employees to collective bargain. That is the beginning of the discussion and the roadmap and the foundation of the president pushing forward with the $15 minimum wage, which we will talk about a little bit later as we talk about the stimulus package moving forward. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about new OSHA guidance moving forward, but there's also, as part of his executive order, calling on OSHA to determine by mid-March to determine whether there should be emergency temporary standards put forth for the prevention of COVID moving forward. And then finally, before I turn it over to Omar to talk about the costs of carbon, is what the Trump administration is doing is they are following the Administrative Procedures Act. President Trump, when he came into office, he wanted to do things big, bold, and fast. Well, the rulemaking process in the federal government does not take days or weeks. It takes months and years. And the Trump administration was so eager to get rules changed moving forward, they cut some corners. And so some of the rules that the Trump administration had pursued were successfully overturned at the court, not based on policy, but based on administrative errors that were crafted when they were putting these rules together. So the Biden administration has put forth an executive order calling their agencies to make sure that they follow the Administrative Procedures Act. Omar?
Yeah, you're right, John. And you'd think that's something pretty basic, but that really is something that hung up the previous administration that actually had 151 different rules and regulations either overturned by the courts or withdrawn by the agencies, in large part, to John's point, due to violations of the Administrative Procedures Act, including just 3 last week that are very significant to us that we've been lobbying on. So as you see some of these that are out here, we are expecting a number, as John mentioned, that are going to be dealing with the social cost of carbon, benefit cost analysis, and it'll make it a lot easier to justify some of the rulemaking that's coming forward. So we do expect a very busy season. To John's point here, we do expect most of the regulatory actions to really to jump up around the end of March, early April time, as the agencies start to increase the number of their appointees that have been confirmed by the U.S. Senate. And something to keep in mind with these executive orders, I mean, they do continue on through the administrations. We've got one that goes back to Harry Truman that was undone by Eisenhower, undone again, or re-put in place by JFK, and then Nixon undid, back and forth. And so the reason that they use these right now, as you'll see here as we jump into back to COVID issues, the reason a president uses executive orders because they can act quickly, to John's point, without having to go through a lot of the APA and the public comment period that typically will drag this out, per John's point. So bringing that full circle, based on that previous slide, as we focus on COVID here for a while, take a look at what they've now done. One of those executive orders dictated, and again, an executive order tells an agency to carry out an act. So in this case, the president directed OSHA to come up with guidance within the next 2 weeks of signage, which they have, and we're going to start running through the guidance starting the next slide. Further, he said that by March 15th, John mentioned this, I need a full emergency temporary standard on COVID-19. Now, I see in our attendee list, you have a number of our friends from California. Since November, you've been dealing with your own emergency temporary standard. And by the way, the California is going to be reviewing that again on a hearing on February 11th and 12th in the coming week. So California, you might be getting another round of changes right when you just began to implement your own ETS. So now we're looking at possibly a federal standard. What we have today is a guidance. A guidance, as you'll see from the red below, is a guidance for planning purposes, is not a standard or regulation, and creates no new legal obligations. It contains recommendations. Now, again, you all work with very capable labor lawyers, so we won't try to pretend to be them, but it's important to what can you extrapolate from this? Okay, we're telling you it's a guidance. It is not binding from the federal government. However, you look down at the general duty clause and some of the other state approved plans that you still already have to comply with. Here's what we would suggest. This is giving you insight into the emergency temporary federal standard that will be coming out in the next 3 to 4 weeks, which will have some level of binding effect upon you. So if you're getting ready and starting to plan, how are you going to adjust for a new OSHA federal standard? This guidance will help give you some clues into what might be coming your way. Some of these, many of you have already done, whether it's assignment of a workplace coordinator, how do you do that hazardous communications, hazardous assessment and identifications? Those are things that we've been talking about since last summer, and frankly, since the Obama administration, you've already been comfortable in understanding the importance of hazard identification and training in the workplace. Now Biden administration wants to have you do it for COVID as well, going through a number of the protocols. As always, this presentation will be sent out and will be available, as Caitlin said, on onevoiceinfo.org. You click on webinars and every one of them will be there, including this slide deck afterwards, so we don't spend too much time on each individual. But one thing, this is going to tie in here pretty closely with some of our other issues we've been preaching to you about, which is not just the communication, education, training, and then the record keeping of when that training was done. If there's a new COVID policy that you put in place, and John's going to talk about physical barriers in about 3 or 4 slides here, and how are you going to train your employees about that? Who's going to clean all those? These are some of the things that now have to be incorporated into the traditional workplace manual for the time being, for as long as we're under the emergency temporary standard. And again, many of your states have already begun doing these. They are already looking at, in this guidance, new closing of areas for those that are proximity with people that have been affected. You all recall that we did have some CDC information that said within 48 hours, open ventilation for X amount of days. This is now OSHA taking some of that and setting it more into formality. Again, we're looking at guidance, but increasingly we would defer to the attorneys, but what we're hearing is this is going to be the basis and the foundation for what will be an emergency temporary standard that could then ultimately lead to a more permanent OSHA standard that even extends beyond that ETS. What we're understanding is most likely they tie the ETS for the duration that we are in the pandemic emergency, which again, we don't know when that could be lifted. The only two we want to highlight here, we already been mentioning the importance of your 300 logs. By the way, don't forget March 2nd, folks, HR department, March 2nd, your 300s file electronically, they're due. Please do not forget that and do in a few weeks. Making your COVID vaccine series available at no cost to eligible employees. All of those are critical. And this is the last area where we want to spend time on before I turn it over to John. The use of face coverings. Since we sent this out around to a number of manufacturers when it was released, as you can see, last Friday, January 29th, the number one question we've gotten back, and I'm sure the attorneys have as well, is on face coverings, and specifically with regards to cloth versus masks versus shields. Now the face shields, as you'll see here, let's just jump, it's not underlined, but if you take a look at the third square bullet down below, beginning with 4 operations and then jump to the last of it, the face shield, the face coverings down there, face shields may be provided for use with face coverings. See, it says the word with face coverings to protect them from getting wet and soiled, but they do not provide protection themselves. So you put those two phrases together. Face shields do not provide protection by themselves. That is something that we as manufacturers need to take a look at, especially in terms of how that affects the operation of machinery and even the safety of employees. Many of you have certain operators themselves that are going to be in a position that may not be able to have those types of face coverings unless you have the NIOSH approved. And by the way, some of the NIOSH approved have, as we talked 2 weeks ago, have been approved by CDC on a temporary basis. So please take a look at this slide, especially when you go back with your HR department and try to see how you combine this issue and reconcile it with John, what he's going to talk about right now with some of the physical space and the new physical barriers.
Thanks, Omar. So OSHA came out with those 15 guidances of what you should be doing, which we anticipate to be part of, an emergency temporary standard. And, we've talked about it in previous webinars over the past several months. So much of that should not be new. They added on to it the requirement of face coverings. When we started the pandemic, face coverings were not considered PPE. Clearly that has changed under the Biden administration. So the guidance is implement those 15, work on the face coverings, and now the question is physical space. Again, this should not be new to any of you because we've talked over the past several months that you need to maintain the 6 feet barrier. You must put up signs reminding your employees to maintain social distancing and the 6 foot barrier. We even showed you little cartoon photographs of how to set up your workspace. We've suggested that some of you may have to change your workspace in your shops to maintain that 6 foot barrier. So in addition to those 15 points, in addition to cloths and spaces, we also need to deal with barriers. As you've seen already, going to the grocery store, going to the pharmacy, you're seeing those shields. If you cannot maintain social distancing, a 6 foot barrier between you and your employees, even if you did rework your workspace, you must be setting up these barriers, these plastic barriers. And here on this link, it'll talk to you about how you set up these barriers and the openings that must be. They must be set up based on the height and the size of that individual who's working in their particular workspace. And that link, will give you all those details. And that if you can't provide barriers, if you can't provide the physical space and such, then they say, well, you must then provide as an employer, you must provide PPE for your employees. And here is the guidance moving forward on the PPP. So in addition to all those recommendations, OSHA has continued to maintain industry-specific guidelines. And in certain industries, as this slide shows, that there's a number of critical essential worker industries that will have that OSHA is continuing to maintain separate industry standards moving forward. So now let's talk about the PPP program, a very popular program. We were successful in the last relief act that the Congress passed at the end of the year to restart the PPP program. It allows those who did not receive a first draw to get a first draw and allow folks under circumstances under 300 employees that can demonstrate revenue loss from one quarter of the same quarter from 19 to 20 would be eligible for a second draw PPP loan. And here's a recent update. $67 billion in loans have been issued since the program took off in mid-January. So clearly it's very successful. If you see to the right, close to 5,000 lenders are participating in the program. That is, that is a real positive considering how few lenders participated in the Federal Reserve's Main Street lending program. And so this remains a popular program, not only with manufacturers and people who need a second draw PPP, but also with the lenders. And then when you compare the dollars and the loans that have been put out, manufacturing remains number 4, like we did in the first round of the PPP, ranks 4th. Don't have as many loans out there as some of the other industries are, but our loans are of a higher value moving forward. And before I turn it over to Omar on this, I do want to touch on, we were successful in the legislation to make sure, contrary to what Department of Treasury wanted, was to make sure that when you went through the loan forgiveness process, that you were not taxed federally on your loan forgiveness. Well, we are seeing many states some are strapped for cash because of the COVID situation, looking at perhaps loan forgiveness that, hey, we could tap those resources as perhaps revenue for the state governments. Now, 21, as this map demonstrates, 21 states follow the Internal Revenue Code. So they're not going to be the ones who are going to be taxing your forgiven loan, but there are several different levels of states that are looking at if and how they would tax a forgiven loan. Some are following the CARES Act. Others are distinguishing between a C Corp and a pass-through. The bottom line is, talk to your accountant. Are you living in one of those states that are looking at taxing your forgiven PPP loan? And if you are, make sure you reach out to your state representative, state senator, to tell them that this is wrong.
Yeah, you really want to focus on a couple of things here. Obviously, as John mentioned, there's certain states that are following the CARES Act. Obviously you're looking at the date stamp up here, January 1st, which was definitely a different world in which we are today. But you've got some states like Wisconsin that did peg their IRC, their Internal Revenue Code, to the federal government specifically for the CARES Act. You've got areas such as Massachusetts that do differentiate. Connecticut does differentiate in some areas between a C Corp and a pass-through. Those are certainly things to watch out for. We are aware, we've been talking to some of our members in Minnesota with regards to activity in that state right now, where there is legislation already available. We are talking to some folks here in Washington. We did hear back from some groups. We do know that NAM responded as we expected. They take the position they don't get involved in state activities. And so therefore, we're trying to get a better sense of if there is a coordinated effort. As of now, we have not. So to John's point, be sure you're looking at the close level at 2 points here. One is whether or not it's taxable as income if it's forgiven, then also if those expenses are deductible at the state level. And then if there's a further breakdown, as John mentioned, this is a state by state. So a few of you here we see on the call have multiple facilities in multiple states. Be sure to watch out for that. That's not something the federal government can handle. That's going to be done at the state level, and it's going to take some of you by surprise. So please watch out for that one, to John's point. And then that brings us to, where do we go from here, and Congress and next steps, and what does it look like in these 100 days? Right now, as we can see here, Biden back on January 14th proposed $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill. $618 billion in the offer from 10 roughly moderate senators that took it to the White House a few days ago on Monday, saying, here's what we're looking at. We're offering 1.9. Biden says they want 618. In a normal world, you'd split it at 1.2, 1.3, somewhere that range. And you even heard Larry Summers come out recently and say similarly that we don't want to go as high, maybe as 2 trillion, maybe better down, being a bit lower. I don't want to get too much into the politics of what separates these two sides. Let's just get into what we care about here and give you a little overview. So the reason we're putting up what's in the 618 billion that the Republicans put forward is so you can get an idea of what might be a baseline for any COVID relief bill. And then I'll get into the details of how you actually get through reconciliation after John runs through whether or not he thinks the deal is possible here. But quickly, just so you take a look at, the Republicans were offering another $40 billion for the PPP, $300 per week, goes through June 30th. Senate Democrats want that unemployment insurance extended another 6 months, meaning through September. And then Biden is holding very firm, everything we're reading and hearing, very firm to the $1,400 checks, though he's willing to limit the number of people that are eligible for it. But John, is it really about numbers? Are we wasting time? Should the Democrats stick around and try to cut a deal with Democrats and vice versa? What do you think?
Well, I think the 10 Democrat senators have come to the White House in good faith to try to negotiate with the president on a bipartisan solution moving forward on COVID relief. And the 10 senators are critical, is a key number, because you need 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. And so if you have the 50 Democrats and then the 10 Republicans, then you have the 60 votes to do a bipartisan stimulus bill moving forward. The concern with many of the Democrats, and particularly on the House side, is they're whispering in Chuck Schumer's ear, is that if you get a deal that those 10 moderate Republicans go along with, you might be losing 2 or 3 of the more progressives in the United States Senate, the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Will they be willing to agree to terms that those 10 moderate senators have? So in the end, I don't believe they're going to do this bipartisan solution. We saw last night the Senate passed a budget resolution, and I'll turn it over to Omar to talk about the details and the nuts and bolts of a budget resolution, budget reconciliation. So the Senate Democrats are independently moving forward on a Democrat-only solution for this next stimulus package.
Yeah, that's right, John. And part of that is procedurally. And let's take a look at what does reconciliation mean. And as you'll see down here, John's point, Democrats are in a hurry. Why? Because we're looking at March 14th being that key date by which that they're all focused. And the reason they're focused on that date of March 14th is because that's when the unemployment insurance begins to expire there. And as you move forward and take a look here on Democrats' 2 pathways, do they sit around and do they try to wait for Republicans to come along? And I think many of them are in a hurry because of that deadline that we looked at of March 14th. So if no deal looks like it's possible here by the end of, let's say, next Sunday, so in the next 8-9 days, Democrats, I think they're already on the pathway to go it alone. What does budget reconciliation mean? To simplify, in the Senate, you normally need 60 votes in order to move a bill without having to go through a filibuster. Budget reconciliation removes the possibility of a filibuster. You only need 50 Senate votes, meaning Kamala Harris, the vice president, will be the one that breaks the 50-50 tie, as she did early this morning around 5:30 to move the Senate budget resolution through. So this means you do not need a single Republican vote as long as you keep all 48 Democrats and 2 independents, being King of Maine and Sanders of Vermont. So now GOP used reconciliation. What's the history of this? The Republicans used reconciliation twice in 2017. They used it once to try to repeal Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and that's the vote where John McCain in the first week of August put his thumbs down on the Senate floor, and they were not able to do so. In the second attempt, and so that's how they failed to reach 50 on that first time in 2017 using reconciliation. The second time in December, they were successful in passing the tax cut law that we all lobbied extensively on and got the tax reduction for all of you on this webinar. And so that December reconciliation vote, again, did not have a single Democrat go along. Same thing that Democrats did to Republicans in 2010 when they passed the Affordable Care Act with, again, 0 Republicans on board. So the process of reconciliation, here's where we are right now. We are in the budget resolution, step 1 phase. What that does is it instructs committees to come up with spending up to a certain amount. For example, the Ways and Means, the Tax Writing Committee has wiggle room of about $918 or $948 billion, I think it's $918 billion worth of spending that single committee can do. Education Committee has its own, Commerce, etc. So what this means is all of those committees next week, they're beginning the markup process, will say, here are our priorities for COVID relief. From there, they will be assembled together by the budget committees the week after next, and they're going to go to the House floor the last week of February for a vote on what's going to be in this thing. And so that tells you how quickly they're going to move, as you can see from here, especially when it only needs 50 Senate votes. Getting the votes in the House is not the question. The question is, do they lose any Democrats and independents, to John's point? So procedurally, what can be in reconciliation? You start at the very bottom. There's something called the Byrd Rule. In the early 1980s, under President Reagan, Congress used reconciliation 25 times to move legislation under that simple majority. Then Robert Byrd, the senator from Virginia, West Virginia said that's enough and put in some limits of that these must have a budgetary impact that cannot be incidental. So meaning that the policy that you're trying to do has to be directly related to the budget, up or down, and you're only allowed to spend above a certain amount over the 10-year window. So we have a $1.9 trillion. What can go in? What can go out? Tax increases, those can go in. We're very aware that net operating loss is on the list of items that is going to be used potentially as a pay for. The estate tax, death tax, that is on the list of potential pay fors. C corporate rate, pass-through rates, all of these items are eligible. Renewable energy, carbon taxes, some infrastructure will be eligible, obviously healthcare, as other social welfare programs. The $15 an hour though, John, and labor laws and union issues, those we really don't see as being eligible. The Senate parliamentarian will say they do not have a direct budgetary impact, but John, I don't know, what are your thoughts? There's certainly a momentum. It seems like we're marching to reconciliation. I think by the next webinar we have with you all, we will be on that pathway without Republican involvement, is my guess, John.
Yeah, I do, Omar. And to Omar's point, and to those who are concerned that Democrats are in control of everything, the White House, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Keep in mind those numbers are very slim. As Omar pointed out, they only have 50 votes, 50 votes plus the vice president in the Senate. Nancy Pelosi has a very slim majority in the House of Representatives. So they're not going to ram through court packing through budget reconciliation because it doesn't have a revenue impact. And so I may disagree a little bit with Omar that there's not a problem in the House because they do have such a slim majority. It depends on what they do include in that. But we'll wait and see. And I do agree they're going to try to bring this to the floor by the end of February to try to meet the deadline of March 14th. These are very aggressive deadlines and goals. And as we have seen over the past several months in the development of future stimulus and relief packages moving forward, goals and dates have always been set, and almost never did they meet them. And so I am a little more pessimistic, thinking, yes, the extended unemployment expires in mid-March. I'm thinking that they probably come to an agreement on this because of these tight margins in the House and the Senate, probably by the end of March, perhaps the first week in April, before they break for the Easter recess.
Yep, I agree. So we'll see where we end up being. We're another webinar here heading up shortly, and we're gonna be focusing here on taxes with some others we're hearing. So definitely stay tuned because that's what we expect to happen. Turn it over to Bracewell. Want to give us an update?
Sure. If you maybe show the next chart first. Can you go one slide more? Yeah, I wanted to talk about steel prices. Obviously Omar and John and your One Voice team are really focused on the COVID relief package and other things related to that. But that's not to say we haven't kept our eye out on the issue that we've been hearing a great deal from you all, and that is steel availability, steel prices. This is a chart that the Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users keeps updated based on Steel Benchmarker report. That blue line, for those who can't see it well, are U.S. steel prices compared to Europe, China, and global prices. And you can see how the spread has widened over the past few months. I have been hearing, and Omar and John and Kaylin have been hearing, and I know that PMA and NTMA have been hearing from all various members about the challenges not only with prices but of availability, and supply related supply issues. So we are focused on, first of all, our job is to shine a light on this issue and to make folks aware in Washington, D.C. that this is happening. Obviously one of the quickest, well, not quick, but one of the ways that the government can help right away is to eliminate the Section 232 tariffs, to terminate them. The national security 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum imports imposed by President Trump is completely an executive branch issue, so that it was imposed by the executive branch, and it could be terminated by the executive branch through the signature of the president. So we first need to define the issue for policymakers and through the media and other means, and then we are working on direct contact with the new Biden administration in terminating the tariffs. So Omar, if you go back to the other slide, I can show some of the thank you to the members who are on this call, who are our media volunteers who have talked to the media. This is just a few of we had a recent Wall Street Journal story that quoted a PMA member. This shows you also other media hits that we've gotten on other issues. We arranged for another Wall Street Journal interview on stainless with another media member. I have a couple calls today with more reporters. So for those PMA and NTMA members who are listening, watching this webinar, if you have, we are asking two things. One, if you are experiencing issues with steel or aluminum, please let us know. Not even if you do not want to speak to the media, we'll keep it confidential. And number two, if you do want to be a media volunteer, please indicate that and I can reach out to you. We have plenty of inquiries and we need your help. So we understand that this is really a situation that is becoming a crisis, and we are working on it. There's not a lot of levers the government can do, but certainly terminating the tariffs is one easy one. Relatively easy compared to other things. So that's what we're working on. Our Coalition of American Metal Manufacturers and Users is sending a letter to President Biden that lays all this out in detail, and I think the letter is going to be, it's a very good letter, and we'll do PR around that as well. Thanks, Omar.
Thank you. I'll turn it over, John. Let's start wrapping it up if you don't mind. It's important to keep on supporting the association when we can.
And so we're about to wrap up. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to type in your question in the box on the right. We'll be able to answer them. But, we've said this before at the end of every webinar, but first of all, I want to thank, there's been a handful of NTMA and PMA members who have listened to this podcast, listened to our appeal to, if you like what you're hearing, to contribute to NTMA's GAF fund, their Government Affairs Administrative Fund, or PMA's Advocacy Fund. These are two critical funds that help us continue to maintain free webinars and the work that we're doing in Washington on your behalf. Since we started doing these webinars, a handful of you have dug deep and have contributed, and so we do want to say thank you. I want to remind you that these are corporate dollars. These are not personal dollars. Of course, you can send a personal contribution for this, but if you like what you've been hearing over the past 25 webinars or so that we have done, we hope you will add to the handful who have already contributed, and hopefully by the time we have the next webinar, I can have two handfuls of PMA and NTMA members who have contributed to each of these advocacy and GAF funds for both the NTMA and PMA. So thank you very much. Omar, do we have any questions in the queue?
Thanks, John. Yeah, we do have a couple, and just a couple of little follow-ups with regards to our comments on reconciliation. We are hearing right now as we're on this webinar that the White House is definitely still pushing on Capitol Hill staff to try to come up with a way to bring Republicans along and avoid having to use reconciliation, even though that seems to be what Democrats are doing. The other follow-up is that we're getting is that Democrats are starting to think about, if this is really a stimulus bill, when do we want the stimulus to start kicking in? And so at that point is, you want it to run now, but for how long do you need the stimulus to continue going? So those are some of the things we know that they're considering. But let's go ahead and start looking through a few of the questions that we got in here. A couple of them. One, are there any templates for the record keeping, either from the government or from the associations? We'll go ahead and check to see with some of the labor attorneys if there are already some record keeping, either related to that have been updated for COVID. I believe that there was something, I want to say back in, it might have been April or more likely in June, that there was some additional guidance that did come out from the Department of Labor in terms of how what would be recordables. So we'll double check to see if there are anything. We'll be sure to post it up on the onevoiceinfo.org and see what we can find there. A couple other questions. Are PPP loans over $2 million subject to potential clawback for up to 6 years? Clarification on that one. In general, the PPP 1 and second draw loans, any rules that were provided for in PPP 1, second draw is generally subject to those two. The 6 year is generally for a record keeping requirement, and that way if they want to come and take a look at it for further auditing, Now, could that be tied to a clawback? I don't want to necessarily make that direct connection. You can probably make that assumption pretty easily as well. But that 6 years is specific to a record keeping requirement. And so, yes, our understanding that the PPP loans currently that are over $2 million are subject to it, but second draw, they are not eligible. You can't have a loan over $2 million anyway in that one. But in general, anything that's subject to the law under PPP1 is second draw. But the clawbacks, excuse me, the record keeping for 6 years on PPP1 on 2 million or up, that remains in place under the rule that they clarified, or the FAQs. PPP loans for amounts less than $50,000 were supposed to be forgiven in their entirety, effectively rolled into grants. There was discussion about doing the same for 100 to 150. What happened with that plan? For companies that received more than 50,000, the first 50 was the amount they received automatically forgiven, or must we seek forgiveness? So let me clarify rather than going through the whole question. The $50,000 threshold, what they did is they created a form 3508S, and that is the simplified form for those loans that are, I believe, under 150. For those loans that are under 50,000 that use that simplified loan, those you do not have to deal with the reduction of employee as part of your forgiveness calculation. So it's not an automatic forgiveness, even if you're under 50,000. You just don't have to go through the reduction of forgiveness amount calculation. So meaning you still have to submit your forgiveness information. They're just not going to lower it beyond the amount as you would somebody that might have not kept their head count or reduced the hours. So that's what that 50,000 threshold is. The 150,000, they did issue additional simplifications in the January 6 FAQ, and then there was another update on January 19th. But essentially, they're still doing that same simplified form. So you don't have automatic forgiveness in anything. It's definitely a much simplified forgiveness, but we do not have automatic forgiveness where you don't have to file anything. Every loan will require some kind of filing for it, for forgiveness. The last question, anyone else has anything else, please feel free to type it in there. You see our contact information as well up above. Please take that down. How does getting rid of tariffs help with customers who only allow domestic materials? One of the issues there is that overall will increase, even if you have, so many of you are ITAR or DFAR, or you're dealing with some of the Buy America, Buy American, and now Made in America requirements. What it also does is it helps reduce or increase rather the supply in the marketplace, therefore theoretically decreasing some of the pricing. So even if you yourself may not be permitted to buy that imported product, at least there's availability and you're now not competing with others who do not face that similar restriction as you. Much of the issue that we're seeing and hearing directly is that on domestic right now, if you can get it both overseas and domestically, the domestic lead times is really what's killing you. Yes, the record pricing Paul indicated, but your lead times, what used to be 4 to 6 weeks, is now getting up to 12 to 16 weeks and even 18. And you can't make a product out of something you can't get. So that's really what we're hearing folks about. It's really just trying to recorrect and create more of the free market economy and free market supply, that with obviously protections against China, that we can get with that material. Because again, the disruptions since October have been significant, and we're seeing it throughout. Are there any other questions as we get ready to wrap up? No. With that, again, thank you. You see the links here. Please, as John said, do what you can to support your association so we can keep doing these, providing you the content. Thank you, Caitlin, for reminding everyone we are now doing a weekly video, 2 minutes with one voice, that you can get through your association distributed. We'll be recording a podcast next week and hopefully be back with you in the next 2 to 3 weeks with a further update with regards. One more question that just came in. It seems like somebody was reading my text messages with another member. Any update on the semiconductor shortage? Yes, we were literally just texting with one of your members about that right now. The auto world is going nuts over this. We've been talking to some of the trade associations that deal with automotive suppliers. That is, their semiconductors is their #1 focus. I assume by now everyone's seen the Wall Street Journal either today or yesterday, where they said the 26-week lead time. So you talk about steel and aluminum lead time, folks, semiconductors at 26 weeks. That is major disruption right now, what we're seeing. The auto industry, we do know they have at the highest levels spoken with the White House about it. We do know there are conversations going on with Capitol Hill. The biggest concern that the Journal confirmed is that right now the auto industry is competing with the rest of the universe that wants the same types of Intel and other chips that are going in there. So this is a really, really on the radar screen of lots of policymakers here in Washington. With regards to an update, I don't know that the government's ready to pick winners and losers get quite yet with regards to saying we're going to mandate that some go into the auto industry. But we were on a webinar yesterday with another association, and the folks in the auto industry are concerned in general, not just on this. So I'm sorry I don't have an additional update other than, yes, everyone in Washington that deals with this is very, very much aware of it on the policymaker level. They're just trying to find a way to get involved without disrupting another market to try to help one market, which I think some of you can appreciate. With that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you, everyone. We'll do as needed, but most likely in the next 2 to 3 weeks, we should have another update, especially if we're down the path on reconciliation, and we'll call together another webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.